All right, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Cari, and I'm a farm girl. I grew up in Central Illinois, specifically Shelbyville. I'm not sure if anybody on the call has been to Shelbyville, but it's a small town of about 5,000 people. It's about an hour and 20 minutes away from where I live right now, which is in Champaign, Illinois. And so today I'm going to be talking about a subject that's very near and dear to my heart, which is farm estate succession and business planning. And before I go any further, I just wanted to make sure that everybody can see my slides okay and can hear me all right. All right.
Yes.
All right, good deal. So not only did I grow up in Central Illinois on a beef cattle farm, but I also have advanced degrees in animal science. I went to Lakeland College and studied agriculture. There for my first 2 years. I went down south to Texas A&M for my bachelor's, back to the university. Oh, we have another Aggie on the line? Excellent, excellent. I have an Aggie reading on. And I have my master's degree in ruminant nutrition. I like to joke that I'm the only lawyer in the country that is a ruminant nutritionist. And I went to law school out on the East Coast, which is basically what took me out to that geographic location. So I spent about a decade of my life in New York City and started my law practice there. And then about 3 years ago, for lack of a better word, I basically moved home and I live here now. I have a farm right outside of Bonneville. So I've got some goats and chickens and rabbits. I like to feed out a few steers, and my garden is up and growing. And I'm also involved in my family's farm still as well. But I serve different sectors of the agriculture industry, primarily farmers and ranchers and agribusiness owners. So today I'm going to be talking about, the different processes, which include estate planning, business planning, and succession planning, and sort of how those three areas overlap, okay, and for this very important subject area. Then we're going to be talking about the who, what, when, where, how, and how much is all this estate planning, having those conversations, and then finally mediation, which is a subject that a lot of people don't think about when considering farm, estate, and succession planning. So we have this interplay with these three different areas with estate, business, and succession planning. And they're all three really important when it comes to this big picture. So if I have a client that comes to me for just estate planning, we at the same time get into a conversation about their business entities or perhaps lack thereof, and perhaps their long-term goals for the farm, which oftentimes include, but not always, the plan to pass it down to the next generation. So these three concepts are separate, but they overlap. Okay, all three of them overlap with one another. So for example, a common business entity, and we're going to get into different business entities, might be something like a limited liability company. And so it's important to think about how does that limited liability company work specifically with your estate planning documents, which might include a trust, which might include a last will and testament. And more importantly, how does that work if somebody dies in a family LLC? How exactly does that transition take place there with the next generation? So let's begin with estate planning. And so this is really what people come to somebody like me to do, right? They usually come to a lawyer, or perhaps they're going online looking for their own forms. They're looking for the paper, right? And that could include things like last will and testament. That's usually the first thing that people think about. But estate planning is usually a much broader project than just a will, although that's a great starting point, right? So a last will and testament is one piece of the puzzle. I would say as a general rule that most people should be thinking about having a revocable living trust. Okay. It's not the first next step for all families. But for those of you that, are like that have land, that have wealth, I would highly suggest thinking about a trust. And we'll talk more about that, going forward. But estate planning also includes advanced directives. That could include the power of attorney for both medical and for property. It could also include a living will, so on and so forth. And some might argue, and I would actually agree, that to some extent, these powers of attorney are even more important than the last will and testament and trust. I remember when I was living in New York City, a client of mine, her father had dementia. She was in a nursing home. And, essentially she wanted to have guardianship over her father so she could, make decisions on his behalf, both medical decisions and also financial decisions. She wanted to be able to have access and pay bills and so on and so forth, but he didn't have a power of attorney. I mean, and to be honest with you, and I can only tell you about my experience with this in New York. I don't know specifically in Illinois, although I don't think it's that dissimilar. It was an expensive process for her, not just in terms of attorney's fees, but it also took probably about 6 to 8 months for her to become the court-appointed guardian of her father. And, something as simple as a power of attorney, whenever he had his cognitive abilities, could have solved that. And so when you're thinking about protecting the farm, right? And if somebody ends up in a coma or something tragic happens, I mean, even just dealing with that alone can be problematic. So it's not just the last will and testament. It's just the will is just one piece of the puzzle here. So let's start with what is a will, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So basically the will says who gets what when you die. And so something that we do at Rinker Law, and I know that other lawyers do as well, we'll have a separate personal property memorandum. Okay. So that would include things like, pieces of jewelry, paintings, I want this particular this particular personal property item to go to somebody specific, right? Maybe a family heirloom. So that you can update as many times as you want, okay? So that does not necessarily get signed at the will signing ceremony. And you don't need to go to somebody like me every single time you want to update that, okay? That's just something that sits into your estate planning binder, and your last will and testament will reference it. Okay. But the last will and testament is also going to know who the executor is of the estate. And I recommend that folks go about 3 levels deep, right? So you're going to start with whoever it is that you appoint. If it's a married couple, perhaps they appoint each other. Okay. And nobody likes to think about this, but what happens if both of you, if you are married, die at the same time? So you need to be thinking about the 2nd level. And then I would even go a 3rd level after that. And another reason to do that is that, a lot of people put off estate planning, and even if it's, I'm not immune to this, even in my own farm family, my parents, very naturally got a last will and testament after I was born. So I think like I was an infant and my parents got a will. They didn't actually update their will until about like 5 to 7 years ago. So my brother wasn't even a named party in the will. And, yes, he certainly would have inherited under the will because it made reference to afterborn children. But my point is that you never know what's going to happen. And while you're doing it, do it, right? Get those 3 levels. Heck, if you want to do a 4th level, go for it. But I think minimally try to get those 3 levels in there. So if you have unemancipated children, or if you are pregnant and you are anticipating having a child, you should reference who is going to be the guardian So that's going to be in that document. It's not going to be in a letter that you leave on your bedside, right? It's going to be in the last will and testament. Testamentary trusts can also be utilized. So we'll talk about different kinds of trusts throughout this presentation, but one kind of trust you can actually create in the last will and testament. And I usually recommend this if there are children that are involved, because, you know, if you think about it, what is a 5-year-old kid going to do with inheriting 50 cows, right? Right. So in that instance, the custodian of the child, typically, but not always, might be the trustee of the testamentary trust that would manage those 50 cows and the proceeds from those cows for the benefit of the child, for the child's health, let's say education. You can put in there, you know, get a car when he's 16. You could make specifications in there, 4-H projects, etc., according to a trust that I just drafted. The last will and testament does need to be executed by 2 disinterested witnesses. So both Illinois and New York, where I practice, there are executive orders that allow right now for wills to be executed via Zoom, which is kind of cool. So I've been doing some will signing ceremonies via Zoom. And so people are having to show their driver's license all close to the computer screen, but it's all been working out great. And so I guess don't let the pandemic be an excuse on putting this off any longer, or updating it, right? So going to the advanced directives, as I just mentioned, these would be things like the power of attorney for property, the power of attorney for medical. So Illinois and in most states separates those 2 documents. So, and remember, these power of attorneys aren't coming into play when somebody dies, right? That's the will. This is when somebody has lost capacity, or perhaps there's a certain event. Like I've had clients give me their power of attorney for a real estate closing because they didn't want to show up to the real estate closing, but I'm only their agent for that one particular day, for that one particular event and that one particular purpose, and that's it, right? So it's a very limited situation. Or I've had a client of mine want a power of attorney to be effect for a surgery, right? And that's it. And then she wanted it to terminate after the surgery. So you can set it up in 2 different ways. Typically what people do, though, is they'll say that it will come into effect if I no longer have capacity. And that's usually measured by when an attending physician says that, or a court order. So there's always a workaround where somebody can go to court and petition otherwise. A living will is different, very different actually, than a last will and testament. So last will and testament is where your assets are going to go, right? A living will is actually more like a power of attorney for medical, but it's sometimes referred to as a do not resuscitate, or you're giving very specific wishes regarding your medical care. That's the type of stuff that would be included in the living will. And I have some clients, but not all, that want to have very specific directions regarding burial, cremation, or memorial service. And so, an attorney like me would go ahead and draft all that up. I have some people that are like, I don't care, I'm dead. But, the suggestion that I give to clients is that if you feel that way, you might not always feel that way, right? Because I know that whenever I've had family members close to me, like my grandpa, for example, whenever, he would go through times of his life where where he wasn't as healthy, and he started caring a lot more about those types of things and having a lot more conversations about it. So I guess just be open for having those documents perhaps change over the course of your life or your family's life. To go on with trusts, and I don't want to get into the weeds on this, okay? But I just want to scratch the surface, all right? So as a general rule, there are two kinds of trusts. There are revocable trusts, which mean that they are modifiable. And then there are irrevocable trusts, which means they are not modifiable. Now, why in the world would a person want an irrevocable trust? Okay. So, and that has to do with Medicaid. Okay. So if you guys have heard of Medicaid trust or Medicaid planning, when people are trying to to stay away from that look back rule, whenever somebody goes into a nursing home and wants to go on Medicaid, they can transfer assets into an irrevocable trust. That would be one of the few reasons why families or farm families would want to consider irrevocable trusts. So, and that decision should take place, depending on the age and health of the parties involved at that particular time, and if Medicaid is a direction that the family is considering, which certainly is not for everyone. Revocable trusts are modifiable, so you can create a revocable trust. And then next week, you can change the terms of the revocable trust. You can move money in, you can move assets out, whatever you want to do there with a revocable trust, because it is modifiable. You have control. And that's the reason why the Medicaid trusts are sheltered there, because you can't move assets in and out. You lose control. And that's whenever the government says, okay, we're gonna stay away from these assets there. So testamentary trusts would fit into a revocable trust, because you can, of course, change your last will and testament at any time. But then the moment that you die, then that trust is then created. A couple other things about trusts I wanted to mention is that a trust is like a bank account. Okay, so simply because you go to the bank and you open up a bank account doesn't mean there's any money in the account, right? The banker is usually like, I need to move money from this account, or I need a check, right, to put the money into the account. So it's the same thing with the trust. A common mistake that a lot of people do is they'll come to somebody like me to create a trust, right? They'll go to an estate planning attorney, and then they won't move anything into the trust. So whatever you want the trust to hold, right? So let's just say it's real estate. You wanted to have all the farmland into the trust. You actually have to quit claim the land, okay, from you as the individual, or perhaps you and your spouse as joint tenants with rights of survivorship, to the trust, okay? So you would do that with a simple deed, and you would make sure that it gets recorded correctly. And then if it's a revocable trust and you want to move it out of the trust, you just redeed the property. And that's what you would do there. So what about things like cattle? So, first of all, I have a client who, that the reason why she came to me is that she had all these cattle in the name of her 5-year-old child at the time, and she wanted to open up a bank account. The bank was like, we can't do this. Your child who's 5 years old can't have their own bank account and their own business. And so what we did is we actually created a trust for her. And so her child owns this cattle operation, right, and has her own bank account in the name of her trust. And so if the livestock have any ownership papers, like a registration paper, you're going to want the registration paper to say the name of the trust. I mean, that's the clearest way about it. But you and I both know that you don't always have to have a registration paper to own livestock, right? So there's a simple affidavit that you can also do where you actually transfer any other personal property, including farm equipment, animals, etc., into the trust that hasn't already been transferred. So that's how you would go ahead and fund the trust with livestock. So let's talk a little bit about business planning, which is the second of the 3 little spheres that overlap. So there are a lot of different types of business entities. These are the main types. First of all, most farms are in a sole proprietorship or a general partnership, including my own farm family, they are Kurt and Pam Rinker, doing business as Rinker Simmentals. They have never incorporated. And trust me, I'm on their butt about this all the time, but because that's really not smart. Okay, because the thing about it is that farms have a lot of risk, right? So there could be a fire that's on your farm, that it could be your fault that the fire was caused, or perhaps it was caused by your neighbor. There could be an injury of a farm worker, for example, or somebody could get killed on your farm from an auger. This happened to a cousin of mine. And so there's risk with just agriculture production. And I feel that people in agriculture need to be smarter about trying to have that corporate shield, that liability shield, to protect their assets, particularly their real property. Okay, but to go through the different kinds of business entities, and I don't know if you guys know of Pat Dillon. I co-wrote a book with him called The Field Manual, which is the guide to New York like food and agriculture law. And he always talks about these in terms of dress code. And I liked his analogy. I'm going to steal it. So, like a sole proprietorship is very casual. So this is like jeans and a t-shirt type of a business entity. Those business entities that are doing business under a different name, which most farms and agribusinesses should be filing for a certificate of assumed name. And there is a publication requirement in the state of Illinois. A lot of people don't know that, and there's a lot of people that aren't in compliance with that. A partnership is a little bit of the same way. You can take it up a notch. You can add a nice belt and some nice boots if you get a written general partnership agreement. Okay. And, a lot of people are like, why do I need to do that? Perhaps I just have a general partnership between my husband and I, or perhaps it's just a family general partnership. But, I can tell you that when I first started my law practice, I actually got a phone call from somebody in, I don't know, Tennessee or Kentucky. It was some state that I didn't practice in at the time. And, his father had just died, and he thought he had a general partnership with him and his father, with all of the land, all of the cattle, all of the farm equipment. And I was like, well, what, is there anything on paper that has your name on it? And he told me no. There was not one thing. It was a handshake deal between him and his dad, and he was depending on the fact that once his dad died, that he was going to then take over all of this. And I don't know how the story ended, but I hope that he was able to work things out between his mother and himself. But that's an example where where two people are doing business together, and there's complete trust there, but at the same time, it's not documented on paper. And then there's a tragedy that happens. And so that's where that paperwork and the general partnership agreement can really come and help you. A limited liability company in terms of dress code would be like business casual. Okay. So this is a hybrid between a corporation and a partnership. All right. Limited liability companies can actually choose on whether or not they want to be taxed as a C Corp or an S Corp. S is pass-through tax. And Illinois actually allows for series LLCs. This is going to show how nerdy I am. I created a series LLC for myself because I wanted to just experiment with it and figure out more about it. And I can tell you the downsides and the upsides. The upsides is that if you're forming multiple business entities, and somebody might do this as a farmer, perhaps they want to have different parcels of their land to be owned by different LLCs, for example. That's a way to sort of have an additional liability shield, okay? And then the mother company, right, might oversee it all. So let's just make up a name. Let's call it like Smith Family Farm Holdings LLC is a series. And then we have like Smith Farm 1 LLC, Smith Farm 2, you get my drift. So there's a $750 filing fee in Illinois, I believe, for the series LLC. And then each child entity, right, each sub entity is only $50. So that's cheap. That is great. So if you're wanting to, if you're in real estate, or if you're wanting to form multiple business entities, so what I did, I formed one for my cattle operation for Cari's farm. I have a blog that I call Discover Illinois, so I formed one for that. So I have multiple levels here with the series LLC, which ended up being cheaper for me and to do that. The downside is that a lot of banks didn't want to deal with me. A lot of banks were like, we don't do bank accounts for series LLCs. And I thought that was interesting because, you know, you're not going to find that information on the Secretary of State's website. I ultimately was able to find a banker to work with me on that. But the main bank, the bank that I have most of my accounts with, did not want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. And also, Illinois has series LLCs, but other states might not recognize it. So it's something to think about. Like, for example, I'm a professional limited liability company. I was formed in New York, not in Illinois. Illinois doesn't recognize a professional limited liability company. So I actually had to file a DBA in Illinois. So it's just something to keep in mind with any kind of those quirky business entities. And then finally, you know, there's corporations, not only S Corps and C Corps, but also B Corps, which tend to be more for the public benefit. And the corporations, in terms of dress code, would be more like suit and tie. They are the most expensive, not in terms of filing initially, but they are more expensive in terms of administrative overhead. So not only are you going to have annual shareholder minutes, for example, you're going to also have to have annual board of director minutes. So it's just, everything is a little bit more duplicative with corporations as compared to limited liability companies. There are certainly advantages and disadvantages to each of these 4 different business entities that I'd be happy to address further in any kind of Q&A or off this presentation privately. So final word on business planning before we move on to succession planning is that, you know, I do a lot of family law as well. So my joke is I do horses and divorces, but so I love prenups. I wrote an article about like the top 10 reasons why prenups are romantic, but prenups in agriculture really should stop being taboo. And I think that they need to be part of a farm business plan, you know. So I am not married and there are no prospective suitors right now, but I can tell you that if I was going to get married, I can't wait for a guy to get on one knee and ask me if I'll sign a prenup with him. And my parents also will want to make sure that there is a prenuptial agreement in place stating that that person's going to waive their rights to any inheritance that I would receive, or perhaps any ownership that I would have in my family's farm operation. I've had some prenuptial agreements where I've negotiated vesting schedules for spouses, depending on the length of the marriage, etc. But remember that divorce is one of the big D's that hurts family farms, right? So death, destruction, but also divorce. And a prenuptial agreement should really be part of the conversation. And if people are already married, perhaps a postnuptial agreement should be considered. So getting into the next part of the discussion, which is succession planning, I wanted to start that, you know, succession planning is different than estate planning, right? Estate planning is the paper, that is the will, the trust, etc. Business planning is the business entity, right, that kind of goes along with that. But succession planning is really more about how are we going to pass this farm from one generation to the next. And do we even have an heir that's interested in taking over the farm? And I can tell you that I have clients right now that it is challenging to find somebody who is within the family who's willing to take over the farm. Even for myself, I am an off-farm heir. I think a lot of farms are struggling right now with having those on-farm heirs that are interested, and perhaps they're even having trouble finding heirs at all, or even other prospective buyers. This is actually a photograph of my own family. This is my grandfather and my cousin Austin and my uncle Earl. So it's 3 generations. They're Rinker farmers. And I mean, I think ultimately this is what the dream is, right? This is what we all aspire to, is to have these farms that are able to be passed down from one generation to the next. But it's more than just having a last will and testament and a trust, right? Because I think, and I've really struggled with this myself, because like if something would happen to my parents, my parents have a very traditional split in what they do. My father is the farmer, he's the one doing the physical labor, and my mom has just as an important of a role because she is actually doing the books, right? And I don't know how to fill either one of those shoes. And so how do you pass down those managerial skills to the subsequent generation? So one of the things that I think is really important here is to think about maybe even having a business plan. Something that I have at Rinker Law are operations manuals. In fact, I'm getting ready to have a secretary start in the Shelbyville office. I have offices both in Champaign and my hometown of Shelbyville. And we're trying to update the operations manual so somebody with a fresh set of eyes could really learn how to do the things that we do them here at Rinker Law. So, I mean, I don't know what percentage of farms actually have operations manuals. I've never done a survey, but I would imagine it would be quite low. And, I wonder why that is, because I feel that in a lot of other types of business entities, industries, that we would have those operation manuals in place as sort of a guidebook, so to speak, for people on how to do things. I mean, somebody like my father has been a cattleman for decades, right? I mean, how in the world is he going to transfer everything that he has learned over decades of his life to my brother and I? I mean, he can't, right? But an operations manual is a one place to start that transfer of knowledge. But I think ultimately it takes people like my brother and I really stepping in and physically doing the work, and then my father doing more teaching, right? And I'm not trying to give my dad a hard time. I'm just giving an example of what really needs to happen to pass down those managerial skills. So I think that all of that comes into play on like what is the plan? Like, who is really willing to step up and to be taught all of those things, So, and even in my own farm family, for example, if something would happen to my parents, I mean, would we be hiring a farm manager or a herdsman to take care of things? I mean, or would my brother be the one that would step up, or would it be me? I mean, those are the conversations that every farm family has to have. And by the way, the answer to that question could very much change over time. So I already talked a little bit about operations manuals, so I don't want to go into any more depth here. So I'll move on. But a final word on planning, and I'm going to also use another Pat Dillon analogy. And in the book that we co-wrote together, we talked about how estate planning is like juggling, right? So if you're juggling like 3 different balls at the same time, one is always at the top, right? And one's at the bottom. And so if you think about those balls really being your priorities, and those priorities can shift over time. Like, for example, I have some farms where federal farm programs is the number 1 priority. Well, if you're telling me that federal farm programs and trying to get as much money as you can through the federal farm programs, I am going to have different advice for you for what business entity that you should form. For example, it might be more advantageous for you to form a general partnership as opposed to a limited liability company. Okay. So, and depending on the goals throughout your life, the goal might then be, you know, limitation of liability. Well, then we're going to be shifting the conversation and be talking about LLCs. We're going to be talking about corporations and comparing and contrasting the two. So who, what, when, where, how, and how much does all this cost? So who, one of my biggest pet peeves with not just agriculture and farm families, but everyone is that I feel that everybody thinks that estate planning is only for people that are old, people that have kids, or people that have a lot of money. And that's just not really the case, because here's the deal, is that the government already has an estate plan for you. You know, it's written in the law, right? And so I guess the question is that, are you okay with that? Or do you want to make any tweaks to the law whatsoever? For example, maybe the only tweak that you want to make is that you want to make sure that there is, you know, this particular person is appointed as the executor of your estate. That's the one tweak that you want to make in the law. And you don't want some judge at a courthouse deciding for you that question. Or perhaps you want to, you know, make slight deviations on how the rules of intestacy are in Illinois. So my general advice is that pretty much everybody over the age of 18 should at least have a simple will to have whatever change in the law that he or she desires. Okay. Now, for those of you that own property, that have children, then you might want to be considering additional steps as opposed to just a simple will. But this thing can happen over stages. Okay. So a lot of people get overwhelmed and they're like, I have to have the perfect estate plan. I have to do everything at the same time. I have to have a nice, pretty trust and a fancy will. And let's not forget about all of our advanced directives. And you know what? I think it's okay to do things in stages. So something that I recommend to people is maybe stage one is let's just get the powers of attorney and a simple will done. And then maybe you'll come back to me or another estate planning attorney in a year or 2 years, and let's think about getting the trust and having a pour over will. And let's have a conversation about business entities. Perhaps we form one business entity now, and then in a few years, once you get the hang of that, we'll add on a second business entity. So this could be morphed and massaged over time. It's not a one and done situation. Another piece of advice that I have for people is that to set a deadline. Okay. So one of the things that I did as an attorney was that I literally put a deadline for myself, like I would for any other client. I put it on the calendar and I was like, I'm going to get my estate plan done by X date. And then I was working with another attorney at the time, and we were going to be each other's witnesses for our estate plans. And it took that in order for me to get it done. So that's my big second piece of advice, is that pick a deadline. I don't care when it is. I don't care if it's next summer. I don't care if it's January, but pick a deadline that you're going to do something. If you're going to at least just review what you have, okay? And take that deadline seriously. So we already talked about farm business and succession planning to be done in stages. And in those stages, think about those goals in terms of the timeline. Think about a budget. I think that there's an estate plan that could really fit into anybody's budget, right? It might not be the Rolls Royce, but you know, you could perhaps at least do one step of that plan at that time. And you know, once you get that estate plan in place, you know, I recommend reviewing it every 3 to 5 years. Even something as simple as reviewing to make sure that your beneficiaries are who you think that they are. Like my brother, because I'm unmarried, my brother is the beneficiary to my retirement accounts and things. And, I think that I've changed it, but, to be honest with you, like I haven't checked it for probably 2 years or so. I should probably just confirm to make sure that my brother is actually the beneficiary. So at least minimally every few years, you should be checking your beneficiaries to those accounts that pass by operation of law. So this is not the time to be finding the forms off of the internet, okay? Because the thing is that there could be problems with the execution of these documents. There could be defects in how the documents are drafted. And so it doesn't mean that you're gonna spend a bunch of money on an attorney, but I highly, highly recommend that you don't do it yourself and you do work with an attorney. Okay. And also remember that this is going to be a team effort, not only with the attorney of your choosing, but also your financial advisor, your accountant, perhaps even your extension specialist. I know that there are some extension specialists that really specialize in estate planning and succession planning. And so, have those discussions and, and how much, like I said, I believe that there is an estate plan to fit into everybody's budget, but let's not also try not to be a penny wise and a pound foolish, because we are talking about, the business succession of your, farm or agribusiness. So carefully interview attorneys, find somebody competent and experienced in family farm estate business and succession planning. And then again, consider having that team effort with other professionals as well. I recently spoke on farm and succession planning to a group of cattlemen in South Dakota. And this topic about having those conversations came up. And, I don't have all the answers here because, sometimes I bring it up to my own family and it's well received, and other times it's just not the time to be talking about it. But, I'm curious about your guys' thoughts on this when we get to the end of the presentation. I just have a few more slides to go. I guess my thought is that every farm family is different, right? I mean, there's never a right time. There are definitely some wrong times, right? The holiday season can sometimes be a good time just because if off-farm heirs are away and they're back for the holidays, that might be a good time to sort of sit down and have that conversation. But whatever time it is that you choose, have this be an ongoing conversation throughout your life. Don't just have it be everybody's going to sit down at the table and meet and then part ways and act like nothing ever happened. No, this needs to be an ongoing conversation. And if you have trouble having that conversation, I would consider mediation. Okay, so I'm a trained mediator. I am an attorney, but you do not have to be a lawyer to be a mediator. There are a lot of great mediators that are not attorneys. And so what a mediator does is they are a neutral third party that helps people have a discussion. So sort of a growing trend right now is actually farm estate and succession mediation. I'm on the agriculture mediation roster for Illinois, for New York, and New Jersey, and we mediate federal farm program disputes and also right to farm disputes for free. There is a discussion. I don't believe that there has been a state yet that has passed this, but there has been a discussion to add farm estate and succession planning to that list that agriculture mediators would mediate. But until it happens, there are private mediators that would be able to do that. And I think that that's an interesting way to perhaps have that conversation for multi-generational farm families that are having difficulty. My final slide is just my contact information. I have my office for my Champaign office, the address there, but I also have an office in Shelbyville. All over social media, so you can connect with me there. I'm trying to Snapchat with the cool kids now, and I also have a YouTube channel.